Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of On Attachment. In today's episode, we are talking about why it is that you might find yourself attracted to or attracting, and we'll talk about that distinction, emotionally unavailable partners. So for a lot of people, you will relate to this experience of finding yourself time and time again in dynamics that have a similar look and feel to them, with partners who are sometimes there, sometimes not. Maybe they open up a bit and then they pull away, and you find yourself so attracted to and attached to these people, notwithstanding the fact that those dynamics can also drive you crazy and leave you feeling really triggered, really activated, and really anxious. And yet, as much as we can consciously, cognitively say we don't want that, there's a part of us that obviously does want that, or at least feels comfortable or safe in that because we keep coming up against it. Now, I've covered aspects of this before on the podcast. If you go back to episode 204 on why you keep repeating the same relationship patterns, aspects of that will be covered today. But I want to really dig into specifically 5 reasons why it is that you might be drawn to emotionally unavailable people, even though that's the opposite of what you say you want. And of course, there can be some frustration in that when we keep experiencing things that feel so counter to what we desire. And yet, of course, that is so much of this work, is understanding the subconscious drivers of our relationship patterns, our behaviors, our choices, the people that we are attracted to. And as you may have heard me say before, whenever people come to me and say, I don't know why I keep attracting these kinds of people, I'm always very quick to redirect the question inwards and get people to reflect on what is it within me that is drawn to those people and those dynamics, because of course it does take 2 to tango. And it's one thing if it's just a one-off, an isolated event, but having worked with thousands of people on this, it's very rare that our relationship patterns are isolated events. Of course, that's why they're patterns. And I think we have to really get honest and curious and own our role in that, even when, as I said, it's not what we say we want. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Some of the pieces that may be going on underneath the surface for us that are driving these ongoing dynamics in our relationships and within ourselves. And the point of all of this is not to shift blame or to shame anyone or to make you feel bad about yourself or to make you feel defeated or deflated or hopeless. It's actually the opposite, because the story of why does this keep happening to me is a really disempowering one. It's one that doesn't really facilitate change because there's no agency in that story. Whereas when we can look in really concrete ways at like, oh yeah, this actually makes sense that I feel comfortable with those types of people, or that some part of me is drawn to that, then we can start understanding why. What need is that meeting? What purpose is that serving? What does that allow us to feel or avoid feeling? And we can find healthier ways to get those needs met or tend to those underlying pieces within us so that we don't have to continue swirling around in dysfunctional or unhealthy dynamics that are ultimately not in service of what we truly desire for ourselves. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Before we get into today's episode, a couple of quick announcements. The first being, you may have heard me share last week that my Secure Self Challenge is coming back in January. For those who aren't familiar, the Secure Self Challenge is a 28-day challenge all about building self-worth. Unlike my courses, which are a bit more meaty and content heavy, the challenge is designed to be really doable. I'm actually completely overhauling it and creating all of the materials from scratch for this next round and shifting to short daily lessons. Previously, we had a weekly lesson, but this time it's going to be like bite-sized 3 to 5 minute daily audio lessons across 4 themes, the 4 pillars of self-worth, which is really central to what I teach. And all of that takes place inside a pop-up community. There's a couple of live calls, but the community space itself is always a really great atmosphere, a really positive vibe, and lots of people connecting and sharing and cheering each other on. So if you know that your self-worth is an area where you could use a little support, and in the new year, I think it's always a really nice time to clarify those intentions and be really deliberate about what we're working towards. The Secure Self Challenge kicking off in the second week of January could be a really beautiful container for you to do that. And I would love to have you. So you can sign up to that via my website. The link is in the show notes. And yeah, I would really love to see you there. Second quick announcement is just to remind you that I have a bunch of free resources as well on my website. I realize not everyone is willing or able to invest financially in this kind of support, and that for some that is a luxury. So if that's you, just a reminder that I have a bunch of free resources, free trainings, workshops, meditations, downloads, all of the things that you can find for free on my website. So head to stephaniereek.com to check that out if you would like. Okay, so let's talk about emotional unavailability and why you might be drawn to people who exhibit these traits of emotional unavailability. Now, it's probably useful to, at the outset, frame what I mean when I talk about emotional unavailability, because I think it is one of those terms that gets tossed around a lot. And it's sort of assumed that everyone knows what everyone's talking about, when I suspect that isn't really the case, because it's not like it's a prescribed term that has some sort of clear dictionary definition. When I talk about emotional unavailability, and certainly for the context of today's discussion, what I'm really talking about is someone who doesn't have the capacity or the willingness to show up to a relationship in a way that would allow that relationship to work towards a secure place. So someone who struggles to be vulnerable, who struggles to be honest, who struggles to take responsibility, who maybe lacks the emotional maturity to stay in difficult moments, someone who's maybe a bit of a commitment phobe, but is also maybe not willing to have those conversations, someone who's quite evasive, all of those traits that I think a lot of us will be familiar with. Someone who's very, very conflict averse and pulls away from conflict, withdraws. And some of you might be kind of listening to that list and seeing some overlap with avoidant attachment patterns. And certainly I think in the Venn diagram there would be overlap for a lot of people with avoidant attachment patterns, although certainly not all. But as we'll talk about today, it's certainly not the exclusive domain of avoidant attachment to be emotionally unavailable. But that's sort of just to give you a bit of a sense of what we're talking about here when we talk about emotional unavailability. It's that idea of you can't quite reach someone, there's inconsistency, there's a lack of clarity, there's a lack of directness, there's a lack of openness and honesty, and all of that contributes to an overall relationship environment that lacks that sense of trust, steadiness, reliability, a felt sense of like, I feel safe here, I know where I stand, I know that I'm valued, and I don't have to be playing games or be bracing for something to change or to happen, because this feels like a really steady ground to be standing on. So let's get into some of the reasons why you might be drawn to that, even though I'm sure in hearing that list, most people would say like, yeah, no, I don't want that. That's what causes me pain, right? Those dynamics are where I suffer. So the first reason that you might be drawn to emotionally unavailable people is that you may struggle with low self-esteem and low self-worth. And when you struggle with low self-esteem and low self-worth, it is often the case that proving yourself and earning love or working hard for it or performing or overgiving, overfunctioning, all of those things feel natural and normal to you, that's just what you know to do in relationships. And so being with someone who withholds or who is highly conditional or who is not particularly generous with their feelings or doesn't express that can feel very familiar at the same time as it feels painful. And if that's what we know to do, trying to interpret someone's behavior, trying to analyze what gets the best response out of them, then that kind of dynamic can feel very comfortable for us, even though it causes us so much anxiety. So if you do have that unworthiness piece, not really feeling good enough and maybe feeling undeserving of someone who fully chooses you, it's almost like we can gravitate towards the person who doesn't fully choose us. And whether we realize it or not, we can have this story running that getting them to choose us would be the ultimate victory, right? I've spoken about this before, and certainly it was part of my relationship pattern before I did a lot of this work was like, if I can prove myself to them, if I can get them to love me, then I'll feel good about myself, which would be very redeeming for my own sense of low self-esteem and low self-worth. So that can be one piece that draws you towards emotionally unavailable people, or at least causes you, once in a relationship or in a connection with someone like that, you may not register their hot and coldness or their withholding of affection or their uncertainty about you. You may not register that as a problem in the sense of a deal breaker or something that would make you rethink the relationship. You register it instead as like a challenge accepted kind of moment where you dig deeper or try and get closer or try and make them change their mind about you. If they're sitting on the fence, you just want to pull them closer to you rather than stepping back and going like, well, I don't want to be with someone who doesn't want to be with me, or I don't want to be with someone where I'm feeling anxious all the time. If that's all we've ever known, someone not fully being there for us or fully showing up or really celebrating us, then that can feel very familiar and not necessarily a problem. Now, related to that, the second reason, if you are someone who grew up in a family system where inconsistency or unreliability or unpredictability were a feature, then emotional unavailability really sits neatly with that kind of template. And it will likely, again, feel very familiar to your nervous system to be in that mode of anticipatory anxiety, of even if things are good, I'm waiting for them to be bad. And when they're bad, I'm going to work really hard to make them be good again. And so that idea of being in a heightened state of stress, anxiety, mobilization in our nervous system, for most of us with anxious attachment patterns, that's just par for the course. That's like a really key piece in our relational blueprint. And as I've spoken about before, this doesn't have to mean that you have a really traumatic family system or you had a really dreadful childhood with a lot of challenges. I mean, for some people that will be there and have more obvious expressions, like, for example, one or both parents who struggled with addiction or other big mental health challenges that really took them away from being able to attune to you and show up for you, and that made the home environment very chaotic. But for a lot of us, those feelings might be more subtle. It's just a sense of sometimes my caregivers are really attuned and present, and other times I can't reach them. And so I feel a lot of separation anxiety. I feel a lot of stress, and I'm very oriented towards trying to control the environment so that I don't have to sit with these bad feelings because I don't know how to hold those bad feelings. I've never really been taught how to stay with myself through difficult emotions. And so I pour a whole lot of energy into trying to make sure that I don't have to experience them at all. And for a lot of people with anxious attachment patterns, that takes the form of trying to control other people and trying to preempt other people's needs and take care of everyone else's needs, doing all of that so that we don't have to feel bad because we feel so affected by other people. Now, if all of that is part of your story in one form or another, and as I said, it can take a lot of different shapes, translated to adult romantic relationships, emotional unavailability, someone who comes and goes, someone who shows up one day and declares their love for you and then says, actually, I can't and I need space. All of that is going to light up your system and feel very familiar at the same time as it feels very painful. And again, if we've only ever known stress, anxiety, and pain in relationships, we don't necessarily register that as something to walk away from. A lot of us will instinctively move towards the problem and try to control it, try to solve it, rather than moving away from it and realizing that maybe that's not the relationship or the partner for us. So if you do have something in your family system around inconsistency, unreliability, unpredictability, then an emotionally unavailable partner who comes and goes or who gives a little then pulls way back, that's going to feel very familiar to your nervous system and is likely going to draw you in and make you feel more attached and more invested to trying to stabilize them or keep them on the good side of things, keep them open to you, keep them them connected, and all of the patterns of shape-shifting and people-pleasing and overgiving and self-abandonment that can be part of that chase. Okay, the next reason that you might be drawn to emotionally unavailable people is that you may have a bit of a savior complex, and you may be most comfortable when you are in the self-appointed role of coach or therapist or caretaker of someone who has either their own stuff going on, mental health challenges, trauma, the emotional unavailability of someone who has a lot of fear of intimacy. If you're someone who's very emotionally attuned, very sensitive, has a lot of love to give, and is a great listener, all of those things can prime you to feel like, I see this person's pain, even in ways that they maybe don't see their pain, and I understand what they need. And so if I can just make them feel safe enough to come out of their shell, to heal their wounds, to let go of their demons, they will be redeemed by my love, and we will live happily ever after. And so we can really over-index on hope and potential. We can see these glimmers in people. And while there's something really beautiful in that, in our compassion and our willingness to see someone's humanity, we have to be really careful and really self-responsible about also engaging honestly with reality as it is, rather than fixating on hope for some future version of someone that ultimately we don't have control over. And while relationships can be a beautiful place to grow together, making it our mission to change someone or to expand their capacity by force, to make them open to us and to make them go to therapy and make them be more vulnerable, I think it's something to really watch for if you see that within yourself. If you find yourself really holding on to little moments where someone opened to you that actually represent a very small fraction of the overall landscape of the relationship, I think we do have to see that for what it is and make sure that we're holding a responsible line there between, yes, allowing for someone to grow and being supportive of that while not making it our responsibility to make them grow, and ultimately wanting to be pursuing a relationship with someone who today, the version of them today, is someone that we want to be with, not just the fantasy of who they could become with, enough influence from us or other people. The fourth reason why you might be drawn to emotionally unavailable people is that the intermittent reinforcement that you get from someone who shows up sometimes and is really open and loving and warm, and you have fun, and maybe there's a strong chemistry or sexual attraction, and then they disappear. That intermittent reinforcement is so addictive. That is a really, really powerful way of drawing you in and keeping you hooked, right? This is how gambling machines work. It's how our phones and social media work. This mechanism of more or less hijacking our dopamine response and keeping us hooked on, when will I get the next reward? I don't know. And so it could be in 5 minutes or it could be in 5 months. But either way, I'm on the edge of my seat and I'm holding my breath in anticipation for the person who may or may not show up. And when we're in that kind of dynamic, the reward, when it comes, if it comes, feels 1,000 times better than the person who is really steady, really reliable, and shows up. Or if someone is always super responsive to your text messages and doesn't give you that adrenaline spike because they're just rock solid and steady and available, that is a very different experience for your nervous system than the dopamine roller coaster of someone who maybe starts replying and then, the 3 dots go away and you don't hear from them for 2 days. Guess who's going to have you checking your phone like an anxious maniac? And guess what's going to feel so amazing? When they reply to you after 2 or 3 days, even if it's like just sending a message saying, hey, sorry, I've been busy, your system is going to be in total overdrive when you get that message, even though it is like a fundamentally underwhelming, disappointing message to receive. So just recognizing that those patterns of intermittent reinforcement, meaning you don't know when you're going to get the reward, have been studied extensively, and it's been well established that that is what makes us most likely to pursue a reward and to be really invested in a reward and to get more of a dopamine response out of the reward when it comes than something that is really reliably fed to us or that is available in a really consistent and predictable way. So your body's neurochemistry is wired such that unpredictable relationship dynamics are going to be more addictive. And there's really a lot to be said for, again, self-responsibility there, seeing it for what it is, not confusing that with like, oh, love and connection and chemistry and it feels so great. No, you're just experiencing a hit of a drug and weaning yourself way off that and actually refusing to engage so that your system doesn't become so trained to seek that out and to hold out for it and then to make all of this meaning about how great it feels and how amazing you feel when you're with them. There's oftentimes a lot more going on than meets the eye, and it has less to do with how amazing they are and more to do with how unpredictable their behavior is. And so the anxiety and the anticipation that that creates in you. Okay. And last but not least, the final reason why you might be attracted to emotionally unavailable people, and this one can be a little hard to hear, but you might be emotionally unavailable yourself. I foreshadowed in the introduction that oftentimes the picture of the emotionally unavailable person we see as being very overlapping with avoidant attachment patterns. So someone who's non-committal and who's aloof and who doesn't want to talk about anything and doesn't want to talk about feelings and is very conflict averse and all of those things. And that can certainly be one form of emotional unavailability. But as I like to remind people, a big part of emotional availability is honesty and directness and vulnerability. And anxiously attached people can really struggle with those things too. And so there can be aspects of emotional unavailability within us that we don't even realize because we feel so emotional. We're like, what do you mean emotionally unavailable? I cry at the drop of a hat and I love talking about feelings. Maybe, but talking about feelings in an analytical way, in a ruminating way, where we're constantly spinning around in stories, that's not the same as really being present with our emotions. And oftentimes we're more attuned to other people's emotions than we are to our own. And we really struggle to be self-responsible around that. We can struggle to regulate our own emotions. We can feel very panicky and very dependent and very reliant on controlling other people or having them do what we want them to do in order that we can feel okay. All of these things can be signs of emotional unavailability within us. We can really struggle with receiving. One of the other pieces that I didn't talk about in this episode, but that is also relevant in the pursuit of emotional unavailability, is that we tend to be more comfortable as the giver or the pursuer. And actually, if someone suddenly showed up in the way that we've been begging them to, a lot of the time, I think we'd really struggle to know what to do with it. If that person turned around and suddenly said, okay, tell me about how you're feeling. Tell me about your biggest fears. We'd probably be a bit like, oh, hang on, I'm not used to actually being in the spotlight, even though I'm constantly grasping and clutching and begging for you to pay attention to me. Sometimes that pleading role or that complaining or that nitpicking or that reaching is a really comfortable place to be, but it's in part comfortable because we don't actually expect the other person to turn around and show up. So it allows us to point the finger at them as being the problem. But suddenly, if the secure person showed up and was fully there and wanted to know us deeply, that might feel very vulnerable. And we might feel a bit naked and realize some blind spots in us around our own emotional availability and how hard that can be. So many of the protest behaviors of anxious attachment are the epitome of emotional unavailability because they are protective strategies that sit on top of vulnerability and tenderness and true emotional presence and ownership. So just recognizing that. And again, none of this is about actually it's not their fault, it's your fault. It's really just to acknowledge that if we keep coming up against this pattern, we too have work to do. And that's really good news, because that means that we aren't powerless. We aren't just victims of other people's terrible behavior. We're participants in our patterns, and that means that we have agency over them, and we can make choices towards something that feels more aligned and something that represents what we deeply desire and not just what we know or what is familiar or comfortable to us. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there because this has gotten pretty long. I hope that has been insightful for you. If a little confronting, I know that some of these conversations, particularly when we are having the mirror held up or we're being called out lovingly about the role that we play in our suffering or our misery or what we don't want, I know it can be hard to hear, but I hope that you're able to receive it in the spirit of compassion and curiosity and ultimately empowerment, and that it, if anything, inspires hope in you that another way is possible, but it just requires some unlearning of some old patterns, which is not always easy work, but it's certainly possible. So sending you lots of love. Thank you, as always, for those who tune in, listen, leave reviews, comments. I read them all, and I'm grateful for you all and your ongoing support, and I'm sending you lots of love. Okay, thanks, guys.